You need to break up with that loser, Emma, before he drags you down completely. My mother's voice cut through the Sunday dinner table like a knife through silk, sharp and deliberate, and designed to wound. I sat there at 27 years old, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, watching her take a sip of her wine as if she hadn't just called the man I loved a loser to my face. My father didn't even look up from his plate, which somehow felt worse than if he'd joined in, his silence a tacit endorsement of her cruelty. This was the reality of dinners at my parents' house in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the crystal gleamed and the conversation cut deeper than any of the sterling silver knives arranged precisely beside our plates. Marcus is a mechanic, my mother continued, her tone suggesting she might as well have been saying he was a serial killer or a con artist. He drives that awful truck and lives in that depressing little apartment. What kind of future is that for you? I wanted to tell her that Marcus was kind, that he was thoughtful, that he looked at me like I was the most important person in the world, but I'd learned over the past 6 months since they'd met him that none of that mattered to them. My parents, Richard and Catherine Morrison, had built their wealth through my father's investment firm and my mother's family money, and they measured everyone they met by the same metric: status, appearance, net worth. My younger sister Rachel sat across from me, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier, her expression carefully neutral in that way she'd perfected over the years when she wanted to avoid conflict. At 24, Rachel had done everything right in our parents' eyes, graduated from Princeton, started working at a prestigious marketing firm, and most importantly, gotten engaged to Brandon Hutchins, a corporate lawyer whose family owned half of Westchester County. Emma works as a social worker, my father finally spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment, as if this explained everything wrong with my life choices. It's basically charity work. She can barely support herself, and now she's dating someone who's equally unsuccessful. The words stung because they weren't entirely untrue, at least not on the surface. I made $48,000 a year working with at-risk teenagers in New Haven, and yes, my parents had been supplementing my income and had paid off my student loans from Columbia, facts they reminded me of with increasing frequency. Marcus worked at an auto repair shop, wore clothes that sometimes had grease stains no amount of washing could remove, and lived in a small apartment above a diner. On paper, we were exactly what my parents feared: underachievers, people who would never belong to the country club or vacation in the Hamptons, or matter in the social circles they inhabited. But Marcus made me laugh. He listened when I talked about my day. He saw value in the work I did, told me I was changing lives, called me brave for choosing a path that mattered over a path that paid. My mother set down her wineglass with a soft click that somehow commanded attention. "If you don't end this ridiculous relationship," she said, her eyes meeting mine with cold determination, "there will be consequences, Emma. We're not going to stand by and watch you throw your life away." I met Marcus 2 years before that terrible dinner, on an afternoon in September when my Honda Civic decided to die on Route 95 between New Haven and Greenwich, steam pouring from under the hood like a distress signal. I'd called AAA and was waiting on the shoulder, watching traffic blur past, when a beat-up Ford F-100 pulled up behind me, and a man in grease-stained jeans and a t-shirt climbed out and asked if I needed help. That was Marcus, though I didn't know his name yet, didn't know anything except that he had kind eyes and capable hands, and a way of explaining what was wrong with my radiator that made me feel like I wasn't stupid for not understanding cars. He stayed with me until the tow truck came, drove me to the repair shop, and when the mechanic there quoted me $12,200 for repairs I couldn't afford, Marcus quietly offered to fix it himself for the cost of parts. "I restore classic cars in my spare time," he said, almost apologetically, as if this incredible kindness needed justification. "Your Civic is easy compared to a '67 Mustang." I said yes because I had no choice financially. But over the 3 days it took him to fix my car, coming to his shop after work to check on progress, I found myself drawn to more than his mechanical skills. Marcus was intelligent in a way that had nothing to do with formal education, talking about philosophy and literature and social justice with a depth that surprised me, listening to my stories about the teenagers I worked with as if they mattered, as if I mattered. When he handed me my keys and refused to take more than $300 for parts, I asked him to dinner, my heart pounding, terrified he'd say no. He said yes. Our relationship developed slowly over months of quiet dinners at small restaurants, long conversations over coffee, weekends spent in his garage workshop where he taught me about engines, and I watched him restore vintage cars with a passion and precision that was almost artistic. Marcus was humble to a fault, deflecting compliments, insisting his work wasn't special, never talking about his past or his family or where he'd come from, and I respected his privacy because I'd learned that some people carry histories they're not ready to share. 6 months ago, I'd made the mistake of introducing him to my parents at a Sunday brunch, watching their faces register thinly veiled disgust when he arrived in his old truck wearing clean but casual clothes, when he mentioned he worked at Tony's Auto Repair on Chapel Street, when he described his apartment above Rosa's diner with genuine affection. "Really, Emma?" my mother had said later, her voice dripping with disdain. "A mechanic?" From that point forward, Marcus was excluded from family gatherings with increasingly transparent excuses, and when he did attend, my parents treated him with cold politeness that barely masked contempt. My father asking pointed questions about his career plans and ambitions, my mother making comments about settling and potential that were clearly directed at me. I watched Marcus handle their cruelty with grace, never defending himself, never getting angry, and I loved him more for it, even as their constant criticism planted seeds of doubt. I hated myself for entertaining, their voices in my head asking if maybe they were right, if maybe I was choosing passion over practicality, if maybe love wasn't enough when bills needed paying and futures needed building. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, my mother's voice bright with false warmth as she announced that Rachel and Brandon had officially gotten engaged, that they were planning an engagement party at the Riverside Country Club for the first Saturday in April, that it would be a beautiful celebration with 200 guests, all the important people in their lives. I congratulated her, genuinely happy for my sister despite everything, and then came the blow I should have anticipated but somehow didn't. "Of course, Emma. This is a very important event for our family," my mother said, her tone shifting to that particular cadence she used when delivering ultimatums disguised as reasonable requests. "We'll be hosting Brandon's family, his father's business associates, people from the club. It's crucial that everything be perfect, that we present well. I'm sure you understand that we can't have Marcus there. It's nothing personal, but he wouldn't be comfortable in that environment. And frankly, we can't have him embarrassing us in front of our friends." I stood in my apartment kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, unable to form words as the hurt crashed over me in waves. "Emma, are you there?" my mother asked, impatient. "You're not bringing him," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not a request. It's a statement." "Don't be dramatic," she replied, irritation creeping in. "This is your sister's special day. Surely you can put aside your stubbornness for one evening and come alone like a normal person." I wanted to hang up, to scream, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her country club and her desperate need for appearances, but instead I said I'd think about it and ended the call, my hands shaking as I set the phone down on the counter. The next evening, my father called, and I knew immediately this wasn't a coincidence, but a coordinated attack. "Emma, your mother told me about your conversation," he began, his voice carrying that boardroom authority he used when he expected compliance. "I want to make you an offer. I'm going to write you a check for $10,000 if you break up with Marcus before Rachel's party. Call it an incentive to come to your senses." I was so shocked I actually laughed, a bitter sound that surprised us both. "You're trying to pay me to break up with my boyfriend?" I asked, incredulous. "I'm trying to help you see reason," he said, completely serious. That money could pay for a nice vacation, help you build savings, give you breathing room. All you have to do is end this relationship that's going nowhere and start thinking about your future. When I refused, when I told him his money couldn't buy my happiness or my choices, his tone turned cold. Then let me be clear about something else, my father said, each word deliberate and cutting. Your mother and I have been supporting you financially because we thought you'd eventually grow up and make better decisions. We paid $85,000 in student loans for you. We've been giving you $1,000 a month to supplement your salary. We bought you that car you're driving. That ends now if you continue with Marcus. We're not going to fund your mistake. I felt the ground shift beneath me, realizing how much control they'd maintained through their generosity, how every dollar had come with invisible strings I'd been too naive to see. Marcus noticed my stress over the following days, asked what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full extent of my parents' cruelty. Too ashamed that my family could be so calculating, too afraid he'd think I was weak for not standing up to them, carrying the weight of their ultimatum alone like a stone in my chest. 2 weeks before Rachel's engagement party, my parents called and asked me to come to their house in Greenwich for what they described as a family discussion, and I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a casual conversation, but something orchestrated and deliberate. My suspicions confirmed when I arrived on that cold Saturday morning in late March, to find not just my mother and father waiting in the formal living room, but also my Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard, my father's sister and her husband, all of them arranged like a tribunal with me as the accused. My mother gestured to the chair facing them, her expression a mixture of concern and determination that I'd learned to recognize as her version of tough love. And I sat down, feeling my stomach twist with anxiety as my father cleared his throat and began what I can only describe as a presentation of Marcus's inadequacies, pulling out a literal list he'd written on a legal pad. Emma, we've asked Patricia and Richard here because we're worried about you, and we think you need to hear from people who care about you that this relationship with Marcus is a mistake, my father said, his voice measured and clinical, as if he were chairing a board meeting rather than discussing my life. Let's look at the facts objectively. He's 32 years old and works as a mechanic with no apparent ambition to advance or improve his situation. He lives in a one-bedroom apartment above a diner. He drives a truck that's older than you are. He has no savings that we can identify, no retirement plan, no prospects for growth. My mother chimed in, her tone softer but no less cutting. Sweetheart, you're 27 now. You need to think about your future. About marriage and children and stability. What kind of life can he provide? What happens when you want to buy a house or send kids to good schools? Uncle Richard leaned forward, his expression grave. Emma, I say this with love, but what kind of future can this man give you? You're educated, you come from a good family, you deserve someone who can match your background and give you the life you're accustomed to. I tried to defend Marcus, tried to explain that he was kind and intelligent and that money wasn't everything, but my words sounded weak even to my own ears as they systematically dismantled every argument I made, 4 against 1, their voices overlapping until I felt like I was drowning. Then, my father delivered the ultimatum I'd been dreading. Here's what's going to happen, Emma. You're going to break up with Marcus before Rachel's engagement party. If you do that, we'll continue supporting you financially, and you'll remain part of this family. If you don't, if you insist on continuing this relationship, then you'll move out of your apartment, since we've been paying half your rent. You'll receive no more monthly support, and you won't be welcome at family gatherings until you come to your senses. We're not going to fund your mistake or watch you throw your life away. I looked at Rachel, who'd been sitting silently on the couch throughout this entire intervention, hoping for some sign of support or solidarity, but she wouldn't meet my eyes, complicit in her silence, and I realized I was completely alone in this room full of family. I left their house shaking, drove back to my apartment in a daze, and sat at my kitchen table calculating my financial reality with growing panic. I had exactly $3,127 in my savings account. My lease was ending in 4 weeks, and without my parents' $1,000 monthly supplement, I'd barely be able to afford rent anywhere in the area on my $42,000 social worker salary. Fear settled over me like a weight, but beneath it was something else. Something harder and hotter that felt like anger, and I still didn't tell Marcus about the ultimatum because I was ashamed that my family could be so calculating and terrified that he'd think less of me for not standing up to them, carrying this impossible choice alone while the deadline ticked closer with each passing day. I called Jenna the day after the intervention, my best friend since college who'd always been able to see through my family's polished exterior to the dysfunction underneath. And when she answered, I broke down completely, telling her everything about the ultimatum and the financial threats and the impossible choice they were forcing me to make. Jenna was furious on my behalf, calling my parents manipulative and toxic, but then she asked questions I couldn't answer, questions that made me realize how little I actually knew about the man I'd been in love with for 2 years. "Emma, where did Marcus go to college?" she asked, and I admitted I didn't know, that he'd never mentioned it, and I'd never asked. "What about his family, his parents? Does he have siblings?" I realized I knew nothing about his background beyond the fact that he'd grown up somewhere on the East Coast, that he was an only child, that his parents had passed away before we met, details so vague they could have meant anything or nothing. "That's strange, don't you think?" Jenna said carefully, not accusatory but concerned. "I mean, you've been together 2 years and he's never talked about his past, his education, where he comes from. Maybe he has secrets too." Her words planted something in my mind that I couldn't shake, and over the following days I found myself noticing things about Marcus I'd somehow overlooked or dismissed, small details that didn't quite fit with the image of a simple mechanic living paycheck to paycheck. I noticed the way he ordered wine at restaurants, discussing vintages and regions with a sophistication that seemed oddly expert for someone who supposedly couldn't afford more than $20 a bottle. I noticed that he was fluent in Spanish and French, languages he'd somehow never mentioned learning, switching effortlessly between them when we encountered tourists at a car show who needed directions. I noticed the art prints in his apartment, reproductions I'd always assumed, but when I looked closer I saw they were originals, small pieces but signed and authenticated, the kind of thing that cost thousands, not hundreds. One evening when Marcus was at my apartment, I saw him check the time on a watch that definitely wasn't the simple Timex he usually wore, something sleek and expensive looking that caught the light before he quickly covered it with his sleeve and switched it for his regular watch. And when I asked about it, he deflected with a smile, saying it was a gift from a long time ago, nothing important. But his eyes held something I couldn't quite read. My curiosity grew, but I was distracted by the ticking clock of my parents' deadline, by the logistics of figuring out where I'd live and how I'd afford rent, and whether I was really ready to sacrifice my entire family for a man who apparently had layers I'd never thought to explore. The two anxieties tangling together until I couldn't separate them, wondering if Jenna was right that Marcus had secrets and what those secrets might mean for us, but also knowing that whatever he was hiding couldn't possibly be worse than the calculated cruelty my parents had shown me, that his privacy felt different from their manipulation, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. 1 week before Rachel's engagement party, I made my decision. The kind of decision that feels like stepping off a cliff without knowing if you can fly or if you'll fall. And I started packing my things into cardboard boxes from the liquor store down the street, methodically sorting through my apartment and my life, trying to calculate what I could afford to keep and what I'd have to leave behind when I moved to whatever cheaper place I could find on my $42,000 salary alone. I was wrapping dishes in newspaper, tears blurring my vision as I worked, when I heard Marcus's key in the lock, and I'd completely forgotten I'd given him a spare key 3 months ago, forgotten that he sometimes stopped by after work on Wednesdays. He walked in still wearing his work clothes, grease stains on his jeans, and stopped dead when he saw the boxes stacked in my living room, my books half packed, my life dismantled. "Emma, what's going on?" he asked, his voice careful and concerned, and something in his tone, the gentleness of it, broke something inside me that had been holding together through sheer force of will. I sat down on the floor surrounded by boxes and I told him everything, the words pouring out in a rush I couldn't control, about the intervention and the ultimatum and the money my father had offered me to break up with him, about how my parents had called him a loser and said he'd never be able to give me anything, about how they were cutting me off financially and excluding me from the family if I didn't end our relationship before the engagement party. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail, and when I finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And I thought maybe he was angry at me for not telling him sooner, or maybe he was realizing I wasn't worth this kind of drama. But then he knelt down beside me on the floor and took my hands in his. "I'm not angry at you," he said, reading my fear perfectly. "I'm angry at them, at what they're putting you through, at what they think gives them the right to treat you this way." He was quiet again, and I could see him wrestling with something, some internal debate playing out behind his eyes, and then he asked a question that changed everything. "Do you want to know who I really am?" I didn't understand what he meant at first, confused because I thought I knew exactly who he was. But then he stood up and pulled me to my feet and led me to the couch, and he started talking. His voice steady, but his hands shaking slightly, as he explained that everything I thought I knew about his life was true but incomplete, that he worked as a mechanic and lived simply, but not because he had to, because he chose to, because he'd been running from something else entirely. "My full name is Marcus Chen Rothschild," he said, watching my face carefully. "My family owns Chen Rothschild Industries." I stared at him, not comprehending, because Chen Rothschild Industries was a manufacturing conglomerate I'd heard of vaguely, the kind of company that appeared in business news, and Marcus was waiting for me to understand. And slowly, impossibly, I did. Marcus explained his background then, sitting on my couch surrounded by my half-packed boxes, his voice steady but carrying an edge of vulnerability I'd never heard before, and the story he told me was so far removed from everything I'd imagined about his life that I felt like I was meeting him for the first time, while also understanding him more deeply than I ever had. He'd grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a 20,000-square-foot house on 5 acres, the only child of Thomas Rothschild and Diana Chen, whose families had merged their manufacturing companies in a marriage that was as much about business as love, though he said they'd actually been happy together until his mother died of cancer when he was 16. He'd attended Yale for undergrad, studying mechanical engineering because even then he'd been fascinated by how things worked, how they were built, and then Harvard for his MBA because that was what Chen Rothschild heirs did, and he'd spent 3 years working in the family business, sitting in board meetings and making acquisition decisions and attending charity galas where people cared more about being seen than actually helping anyone. "I had everything," he said, looking at me with eyes that held old pain. "A corner office at 28, a penthouse in Manhattan, a different expensive watch for every day of the week. And I was absolutely miserable because nothing I did felt real or mattered in any way that I could touch." 5 years ago, when he was 29, he'd told his father he was done, that he couldn't spend his life in boardrooms making rich people richer, and his father had been furious, but eventually came to understand, especially after Marcus explained he wasn't rejecting the family, just choosing a different path. He'd moved to this city where nobody knew his name or his family, taken a job at a small mechanic shop making $35,000 a year, and discovered he loved the work, loved solving mechanical problems with his hands, loved the straightforward honesty of a car that either ran or didn't, no politics or manipulation involved. "I have a trust fund worth $50 million, he said, the number so enormous I couldn't quite process it as real money. Plus stocks and investments and other assets that bring it to around 75 million total, and I haven't touched any of it in 5 years, except to set up automatic donations to charities my mother cared about." He explained that the modest apartment I'd been to dozens of times was actually a building he owned outright, 6 units that generated rental income. He donated entirely to homeless shelters and youth programs, that he lived in the smallest unit and maintained it himself. that the old Ford truck he drove was a 1956 F-100 he'd spent 2 years restoring to perfection and was worth $75,000 to collectors, but priceless to him because he'd done every bit of work himself. He'd been living exclusively on his mechanic salary as a personal challenge, to prove to himself he could make it without his family's money, to understand how most people actually lived, and he'd succeeded, building a life that felt authentic even if it looked modest to people like my parents who judged worth by appearance alone. I sat there on my couch trying to process what Marcus had just told me, the words $50 million echoing in my mind like something from a different language, and my first coherent thought wasn't about the money itself, but about the man sitting next to me who had kept this enormous secret for 2 years. And I found myself asking the question that mattered most, my voice smaller than I intended. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus looked at me with such openness and vulnerability that I felt something shift in my chest, and he said, I wanted someone to love me for who I am, not what I have. And his hand found mine among the newspaper and packing tape scattered around us. Every relationship I had before, once people knew about my family, about the money, everything changed, he continued, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. They saw dollar signs instead of me. They wanted the lifestyle, the connections, the access to wealth, and I could never tell if they actually cared about Marcus or about Marcus Chen Rothschild, heir to a fortune. He looked around at my half-packed apartment, at the evidence of my choice to give up financial security for him, and his eyes were bright with emotion. But you, Emma, from the very first day when I fixed your Honda, and you insisted on paying me even though I offered to do it for free, you never asked about money, never cared about status or appearances, or what I could give you materially. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt like someone saw me, the actual me, not the balance in my bank account. I realized as he spoke that I loved him more in that moment than I ever had before, not because of the revelation about his wealth, but because of what that wealth meant he'd sacrificed to live authentically, because he'd chosen integrity over comfort, because he'd trusted me enough to let me love him without knowing, and because even now, with everything out in the open, he was more concerned about my feelings than about his secret being revealed. I love you more now, I said, and I watched relief flood his face. Not because of the money, Marcus, but because of what you gave up to be yourself, because you have every reason to be arrogant or entitled, and instead you're the most genuine person I've ever met. We sat together in the growing darkness of my apartment, neither of us moving to turn on lights, and Marcus proposed a plan, his voice steady and determined. I'll go to the engagement party with you, he said. But I don't want to reveal my background unless absolutely necessary. I want your parents to accept me as a mechanic, to judge me on my character and how I treat you, not on my family name or bank account. I understood what he was asking, appreciated it even, but I knew my parents better than he did, knew they'd never relent, never see past their own prejudices and status obsession. They won't accept you, I told him honestly, not as a mechanic, not without the kind of credentials they value. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Then they'll have made their choice, he said. But if they push too far, if they try to humiliate you or hurt you, I won't hide who I am anymore, Emma, because you deserve better than their cruelty, and I won't stand by silently while they treat you like you're worth less than your sister, just because you chose love over their approval. We decided then that I wouldn't move out yet, that we'd wait to see what happened at Rachel's engagement party, and as Marcus helped me unpack the boxes I'd filled with such despair just hours earlier, I felt something new growing inside me, not quite hope, but something fiercer, a determination to stand up for myself and for us, regardless of the consequences. And for the first time since my parents had issued their ultimatum, I felt like maybe everything would actually be okay. The phone rang at 8 o'clock the night before Rachel's engagement party, and I knew before I answered that it was my mother, could feel it in the way my stomach clenched and my hand hesitated over the screen. And when I finally accepted the call, Her voice came through cold and precise like a scalpel, no greeting or preamble. Just, "We assume you're coming alone tomorrow." I looked at Marcus sitting across from me at my kitchen table, where we'd been playing cards and trying to pretend everything was normal, and something in me that had been bending under the weight of my parents' expectations for 27 years finally snapped clean through, and I heard myself say with a steadiness that surprised me, "No, Marcus is coming with me." The silence on the other end lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt infinite, and then my mother's voice came back transformed into something I'd heard directed at other people, but never at me, pure fury barely contained beneath a veneer of articulated words. "Then don't bother coming at all," she said, each word dropping like a stone. "You're choosing him over your family." I felt tears starting, but my voice stayed level as I replied, "You're making me choose." And I meant it, meant that she was the one drawing this line in the sand, that I'd never wanted it to come to this, but she was forcing my hand. "Fine," my mother said, and I could picture her face, the way her lips would be pressed into a thin line, the way her eyes would be hard and bright with anger. "If he shows up tomorrow, you're no longer our daughter. We'll cut you off completely. You'll be on your own." She hung up before I could respond, the click of the disconnected call somehow louder than all the words that had preceded it, and I sat there holding my phone and feeling like I'd just witnessed the demolition of a building I'd lived in my entire life, all that familiar architecture collapsing into rubble. The tears came then, not dramatic sobbing, but silent streams down my face that I couldn't seem to stop. And Marcus was beside me immediately, his arms around me, his presence solid and real while everything else felt like it was dissolving. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, and I heard the concern in his voice, the offer implicit in the question to back out, to let me go to the party alone if that would preserve my relationship with my family. I pulled back to look at him, at this man who'd walked away from a fortune to live authentically, who'd loved me without pretense or expectation, who'd kept his secret not to deceive, but to protect something precious, and I felt more certain than I'd felt about anything in years. "I've never been more sure of anything," I told him, and I meant it with every particle of my being. We spent the rest of the evening preparing for the party with a strange calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane, Marcus pressing his nicest suit, simple and well-cut, but understated, nothing that would draw attention, and me choosing a dress I'd bought 2 years ago, navy blue and elegant but not elaborate. And as I zipped it up and looked at myself in the mirror, I felt anxious but also resolved, like a soldier the night before a battle who's already accepted whatever comes. Marcus came up behind me, his reflection meeting mine in the mirror, and he asked quietly, "No matter what happens tomorrow, you know that, right? That I love you?" I turned to face him and nodded, and when we went to bed that night, I lay awake for hours, listening to him breathe beside me, feeling the weight of what I was about to do, knowing that tomorrow would change everything, that I was walking into my sister's engagement party, not just with Marcus, but with a choice I'd made about what kind of person I wanted to be, and underneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like liberation, the strange freedom that comes from finally standing up for yourself, even when you know it's going to cost you everything you've ever known. The country club looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, all white columns and manicured lawns, and that particular atmosphere of old money that had always made me feel like I was play acting at belonging. And as Marcus pulled his vintage Ford truck into the circular driveway among the Mercedes and BMWs and Lexuses, I felt my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. But his hand found mine and squeezed, and I remembered why we were doing this, remembered that I was choosing authenticity over approval, love over status, and myself over their version of who I should be. We walked through the ornate entrance together, Marcus's hand warm and steady at the small of my back, and I saw my parents immediately, standing near the elaborate floral arrangements in the grand foyer greeting arriving guests. And the moment my mother's eyes landed on us, her entire face transformed from practiced hostess smile to something cold and furious, and my father's expression went from surprise to a rage so intense I actually took a step back. My mother moved toward us with frightening speed, her heels clicking on the marble floor like gunshots, and she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and hissed directly into my ear, but not quite quietly enough for nearby guests to miss. "How dare you bring him here?" My father approached Marcus with the kind of cold fury that was somehow worse than shouting, his voice low and controlled as he said, "You're not welcome." And I saw Rachel and Brandon across the room frozen in place, looking uncomfortable, my sister's face pale and guilty, but not guilty enough to actually intervene, never guilty enough to stand up for me when it mattered. Other family friends and relatives were starting to notice the tension, conversations dying out as people turned to watch our family drama unfold like we were entertainment provided for their benefit. And I felt the familiar shame trying to creep in. That old conditioning that told me to make myself smaller, to apologize, to smooth things over. But something had changed in me, and instead I lifted my chin and said loud enough for the growing audience to hear, "Marcus is part of my life, and if you can't accept that, then you're choosing not to have me in yours." My mother's face went red, and she actually laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings, and she said without bothering to lower her voice anymore, "He's a mechanic, Emma. He'll never be able to provide for you. You're throwing your life away on a loser." And the entire room went completely silent, all pretense of polite discretion abandoned as 50 wealthy guests turned to watch my mother publicly humiliate the man I loved. I looked at Marcus expecting to see embarrassment or anger, but his face was calm, controlled, only his eyes showing the fury he was keeping in check, and in that moment, watching him maintain his dignity while my mother tried to strip him of it, I loved him more than I'd ever loved anyone, and I also hated my parents more than I'd known I was capable of hating. These people who'd raised me but never really seen me, who valued appearances over substance and status over love, and who were willing to destroy their daughter's happiness to maintain their shallow vision of what success should look like. My father stepped forward then, his face contorted with an anger I'd seen him direct at business competitors and incompetent employees, but never at me. And he said loud enough that his voice carried across the entire grand foyer, "This is embarrassing. Look at him. Grease probably still under his nails. What are you thinking?" And I felt something crack inside my chest, because this was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, reducing the person I loved to a stereotype based on his occupation, and Marcus's voice when he responded was quiet, but it carried a steel I'd rarely heard from him as he said, "I'm thinking Emma deserves better than this treatment." And my mother actually laughed again, that same bitter sound that made me flinch, and she said with venom dripping from every word, "She deserves better than you." And I looked around at the gathered guests, at least 20 people now watching our family implode in real time, and I saw a range of expressions from uncomfortable sympathy to barely concealed judgment to fascinated voyeurism, and I hated all of them in that moment. Hated that my pain was their entertainment, that my family's dysfunction was playing out like a performance for their benefit. Brandon's parents arrived then, Robert and Patricia Morrison, and I'd met them once before at a dinner my parents had hosted, remembered them as wealthy and status conscious, the kind of people my parents desperately wanted to impress, and I watched my mother's face transform instantly from fury to practiced graciousness as she spotted them, watched her glide over with my father following like they hadn't just been publicly eviscerating their daughter and her boyfriend, and she made a show of greeting them warmly and immediately steering them toward Rachel and Brandon, introducing them with elaborate praise while pointedly excluding Marcus and me from the circle, literally turning her back to us as if we'd ceased to exist. Robert Morrison noticed us standing awkwardly apart, and his naturally polite demeanor prompted him to turn and acknowledge us, asking me with genuine interest what I did for work. And when I told him I was a social worker, he engaged with real questions about the organization I worked for and the population I served, and I felt pathetically grateful for this basic human decency after my parents' cruelty. And then he turned to Marcus and asked what he did, and Marcus explained that he restored classic cars, and I watched Robert's face light up with authentic enthusiasm as he said, "Really? What era do you specialize in?" And Marcus began describing his work with muscle cars from the 60s and 70s, talking about the craftsmanship and engineering with the kind of passion that always made me fall in love with him all over again. And I could see Robert was genuinely interested, asking technical questions about restoration techniques and original parts sourcing, and Marcus answered with the kind of knowledge that comes from years of hands-on experience, combined with deep research. And for just a moment, I felt hope that maybe someone here would see what I saw in him, would recognize his intelligence and expertise and passion, regardless of the grease under his nails my father had so cruelly mentioned. The conversation about vintage cars continued, and I watched Robert Morrison's face light up with increasing enthusiasm as Marcus described the intricacies of carburetor rebuilding and frame-off restoration. And then Robert mentioned almost casually that he'd been looking for someone to restore his 1967 Shelby Mustang GT500, that he'd bought it as a project car 3 years ago, but hadn't found anyone he trusted with the work. And Marcus's eyes brightened the way they always did when he talked about Shelby's, and he said, "The 428 Police Interceptor engine, that's a rare find. Original lime gold paint, I'm guessing?" And Robert actually looked impressed as he nodded and said, "You know your cars." And Marcus began explaining specific restoration techniques for that model, talking about sourcing original Ford parts versus quality reproductions and the importance of maintaining the numbers-matching engine. And I could see Robert hanging on every word, asking questions about timeline and approach. And for just a moment, I felt a surge of pride and vindication, because here was someone who recognized Marcus's expertise and knowledge, regardless of the grease under his fingernails. But then my father's voice cut through the conversation like a knife, sharp and dismissive as he said, "Yes, well, it's a hobby, I suppose." And I saw Marcus's jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained polite. And Robert turned to my father with a slight frown and said with the kind of authority that came from his own considerable wealth and success, "Skilled work, actually. Good mechanics are hard to find, especially ones who understand the historical significance and engineering of classic vehicles." But my mother wasn't about to let this moment of Marcus receiving any kind of validation continue, and she clapped her hands together with false brightness and announced loudly that dinner would be served in the main ballroom and everyone should please make their way to their assigned seats. And I felt the moment shatter as people began moving toward the dining area, and my mother caught my eye with a look of cold fury that told me she knew exactly what she'd just done. The seating arrangements became clear as we entered the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral centerpieces on every table, and I saw immediately that my parents had seated Marcus and me at a table in the far corner of the room, as far from the head table where the family would sit as physically possible without actually putting us outside the building, and it was such a deliberate and public slight that several guests noticed and exchanged uncomfortable glances. And Rachel caught my eye from where she stood near the head table, and I saw guilt flash across her face. But she looked away quickly and said nothing, did nothing, just took her place next to Brandon, like the dutiful golden child she'd always been. We sat at our exile table with 3 other couples who were clearly not close family friends based on their confused looks at the seating arrangement. And I tried to make polite conversation, but I could feel humiliation burning in my chest, could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on us throughout the meal. And when my father stood to make a toast about halfway through dinner, I felt my stomach drop because I knew what was coming, knew he couldn't resist one more public dig at my choices, and I was right, because he raised his champagne glass and talked about Rachel and Brandon and their bright future together. And then he said, with his eyes deliberately avoiding our corner of the room, "It's wonderful to see a daughter who understands the importance of choosing wisely, who recognizes what truly matters in life, and finds a partner who can provide not just love, but security and status, and a future worthy of our family name." And the emphasis on choosing wisely and what truly matters landed like punches, and several guests glanced toward our table with expressions ranging from pity to judgment. And I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to give my father the satisfaction of seeing me break. And then I felt Marcus's hand find mine under the table and squeeze gently. And that simple gesture of solidarity and love gave me the strength to lift my chin and meet my father's gaze across the room with defiance instead of shame. And I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or anger that I wasn't cowering. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I would walk away from all of this, from the money, and the status, and the conditional love, and I would be fine, because I had something they would never understand. Someone who loved me for exactly who I was. After dinner ended, and guests began moving toward the lounge area for coffee and dessert, I excused myself to find the restroom, needing a moment alone to compose myself after the humiliation of my father's toast, but I'd barely made it into the hallway outside the ballroom when I heard my mother's voice sharp behind me saying, "Emma, we need to talk, now." And I turned to find both my parents following me with expressions of cold fury. And my father glanced back to ensure we were out of earshot before he said in a low, dangerous voice, "This is your last chance. We're giving you a choice right now, him or this family." And I felt something inside me go very still and quiet as I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw not my parents but two strangers whose love had always come with conditions I could never meet. My mother stepped closer, her face tight with anger as she said, "We won't pay another cent for anything. Your student loans, your rent, your car insurance, nothing. You'll be completely alone." And she said that last part like it was the worst threat she could imagine, like being alone was a fate worse than death, and I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I kept my voice steady as I said, "I already am alone. You've never cared about what makes me happy." And my father made an impatient gesture with his hand and said, "We care about your future. He can't give you anything. Can't you see that?" And there was genuine incomprehension in his voice, like he truly couldn't understand why I would choose love over the security and status he valued above everything else. I opened my mouth to respond, but Marcus's voice came from behind me, calm and measured as he said, "Actually, I can." And I turned to see him standing a few feet away. And I wondered how long he'd been there, how much he'd heard, and my parents turned to him with expressions of dismissal, my mother's lip actually curling in disdain, and my father said coldly, "This is a family matter. It doesn't concern you." But Marcus walked forward until he was standing beside me, and he said quietly, "It concerns me very much, actually. I've tried to let Emma handle this her way, but I think you need to understand something." And my father's face flushed red as he snapped, "We don't need to understand anything from you. You've done enough damage already." And I saw Marcus's jaw tighten slightly, but his voice remained calm as he said, "You're judging me for being a mechanic. That's my choice, not my limitation." And my mother laughed that bitter sound that had haunted me throughout the evening and said, "Choice or not, it's what you are. It's all you'll ever be." And I saw something shift in Marcus's expression, saw the moment he made the decision to reveal what he'd wanted to keep hidden, and he looked at me with an apology in his eyes before he turned back to my parents and said, "No, it's what I choose to do. There's a difference." Marcus continued speaking with that same calm, measured tone that somehow made every word land with more weight, and he said, "My full name is Marcus Chen Rothschild. My family owns Chen Rothschild Industries." And I watched my parents' faces freeze in identical expressions of shock, their mouths slightly open as if the words hadn't quite registered, and my mother recovered first with a sharp, disbelieving laugh as she said, "You're lying, that's absurd." But there was uncertainty in her voice now, a crack in her absolute conviction, and Marcus simply pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness and pulled up the corporate website for Chen Rothschild Industries. And I saw the screen glow in the dim hallway as he turned it toward my parents, showing them the About page with the family photo, the board of directors listing that included his name, Marcus Chen Rothschild, with the title, Director Emeritus, and my father's face went from flushed red to pale white in the span of seconds as he stared at the screen, and I realized that of course my father would know the name, would know the company, because men like him always knew where the real money was. And Marcus said quietly, I have an MBA from Harvard Business School. I worked in the family business for 3 years after graduation, before I decided corporate life wasn't for me. I've been working as a mechanic for the past 5 years because I choose to, because I love it, because doing work with my hands that I'm passionate about matters more to me than a corner office and a seven-figure salary. And then he named the specific figure, his voice never rising but somehow filling the hallway as he said, I have a trust fund worth $50 million that I've never touched, plus stock options and investments that generate more passive income than I could spend in a lifetime. I own property in 3 states, and the building where Emma has visited my modest apartment actually belongs to me. All 6 units, I live in one and rent out the others and donate that income to homeless shelters and food banks. I stood there frozen as other guests began gathering at the far end of the hallway, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and I saw Rachel and Brandon among them, saw Robert and Patricia Morrison, saw my aunt and uncle, all of them watching this confrontation unfold, and my parents stood speechless for what felt like an eternity before my mother tried to recover, tried to salvage something from this disaster as she said with forced lightness, well, why didn't you say something before? We would have understood. But Marcus cut her off with a shake of his head and said, no, you wouldn't have, and that's exactly the point. You didn't respect me as a mechanic, so you don't get to respect me now. This reaction right here, the way your entire demeanor changed the moment you learned about my family's money. This is exactly what I've spent 5 years trying to escape, and it's exactly why I knew Emma was different. Because she never once asked about my bank account or my family name or what I could provide materially. She loved me for who I am, not what I have. I found my voice then, breaking through the shocked silence that had fallen over the hallway, and I said with tears streaming down my face, but my voice stronger than it had been all evening, you tried to pay me to leave him. You offered me $10,000 like I was something you could buy. You called him a loser. You were willing to disown me, your own daughter, because he didn't meet your standards. And I was crying, but I felt powerful in a way I'd never felt before as I continued. He has more money than you ever will. His family's company is worth more than you could earn in 10 lifetimes. But that's not why I love him. That has nothing to do with why I love him. And I saw my mother's face crumple slightly as the full weight of what she'd done began to register. And I said, I love him because he's kind, because he's genuine, because he sees value in me that you never have, because he chose a life of authenticity over a life of pretense, because he would never treat anyone the way you've treated both of us. And my father opened his mouth to speak, his hand coming up in that familiar placating gesture he'd used my whole life when he wanted to smooth things over without actually changing anything, and he said, Now, Emma, let's not be hasty. Let's talk about this rationally. But I shook my head and took a step back, closer to Marcus, and I said, No, we're done talking. You made your choice. You chose status over your daughter. You chose what other people think over my happiness. You've been choosing that my entire life, and I'm done waiting for you to choose me. And my mother said desperately, Emma, please, we can work this out. But there was calculation in her eyes even now. And I knew she was thinking about Marcus's money, about the Chen Rothschild name, about how this could elevate their social position instead of embarrassing them. And that realization made something finally break free inside me. I reached for Marcus's hand and felt his fingers close around mine, warm and solid and real, and I looked at my parents one last time and said, Let's go. And Marcus nodded, and we turned together and walked past the gathered crowd of guests who parted silently to let us through. And I saw Rachel's face as we passed, saw tears on her cheeks, and something that might have been admiration or regret. And then we were walking through the ballroom where other guests turned to stare, past the table where our untouched dessert still waited, through the ornate lobby with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors that had always seemed so impressive, but now just felt cold, and out into the parking lot where the evening air was cool and clean, and I could finally breathe. The moment we reached Marcus's truck, the truck my parents had mocked, the vintage Ford he'd restored with his own hands, I broke down completely, great racking sobs that shook my whole body, and Marcus pulled me into his arms and held me while I cried. And after a long time, he said quietly, "I'm sorry I revealed it. I wanted them to accept me without it. I wanted to prove that their judgment was wrong on its own terms." And I pulled back to look at his face and said through my tears, "They never would have, don't you see? They never would have accepted you as a mechanic no matter how good or kind or perfect you were, and at least now they know what they lost. At least now they have to live with the knowledge that they threw away their daughter over their own prejudice and superficiality." Marcus wiped my tears with his thumbs and said, "Are you okay? Really okay?" And I thought about it, really thought about it, and realized that underneath the pain and the grief for the relationship with my parents, I'd always wanted but never had, there was something else, something that felt almost like relief, like freedom. And I nodded and said, "I think I will be. I think for the first time in my life, I actually will be." And Marcus kissed my forehead and said, "Let's go home." And we drove away from the country club, away from my parents and their world of appearances and status, and toward whatever life we would build together, and I didn't look back.